In Islam, there exists a concept known as the 5 pillars. They include the Shahada, the declaration of faith, Salah, partaking in 5 daily prayers, Zakat, charity, Sawm, fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, and Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca all Muslims are expected to make if able. Named pillars due to their vital role in holding up and providing solid foundations for Muslim belief. A similar notion can be applied to the quasi-religion of the modern British state, that of liberalism. The modern British state is not one that resembles anything of an institution with thousands of years of history behind it, a system which had adopted elements from a plethora of backgrounds, ideological and religious alike. Rather, appears to have been based solely off of the values of liberal democracy, which are the only guiding values of the state and of many of its residents. British governments do not adhere to any sort of value other than those which represent a culmination of all that liberalism has given birth to since its ultimate ideological victory upon the end of World War II in 1945. 1945 was the birth of Britain as we know it today, but not the birth of Britain as a nation. It is the idea that World War II is our 1776 or our 1789 that has driven liberalism and the attitudes of the people and governments of this nation since it ended. The state religion may be Christianity in name, but to people of antiquity, it would appear that the world and cultural practices of the Britons centered around ideas of so-called progress rather than faith. Without further ado, the 5 pillars of modern Britain are: number 1, diversity and leftist social ideology; number 2, World War II; number 3, the NHS and the social services as a whole; number 4, our mainstream popular culture; and number 5, so-called British values. Although the liberal religion has asserted itself over virtually the entire Western world, these are the pillars that are most specific to Britain itself. Some of these are pretty much applicable to the entire Western world, in particular diversity and consumer culture, and this is very much the case of Britain, and is probably much more prominent and pronounced in everyday life than in most other parts of the West. As is with the idea of pillars as supporting the values that hold up the faith that has virtually seeped its way into every aspect of British life, these 5 pillars of modern Britain may as well keep the roof held above Westminster Palace. The question that lingers though is that of, can they keep that roof held forever? Pillar 1. Diversity and leftist social ideology. The first core idea of the modern British nation that exists amongst much of the liberal establishment and the adherents to it in the population is that we are a nation of immigrants, that the idea of Britishness and what it means to be British does not extend beyond that, one held together by our greatest strength. Parroted to us through state media is the idea that all we have in common with our neighbours is that we live in the same nation, and that alone, regardless of how much or how little we actually have in common, is the one thing that is holding us together as a nation. The liberal trope that the Brittonic Celts and Anglo-Saxons were as incompetent as can be and had to have the rest of the world brought to them to be able to achieve anything, whilst being labelled colonizers for even daring to come here in the first place, serves as the basis for liberal policies regarding migration, which have changed the demographic fabric of this nation forever and have seen Britons become minorities in many of their own settlements. Liberalism at its core is not an ideology that is reliant on or advocates for such stark demographic change or diversity itself, but do you really think the likes of John Locke were about to foresee the demographics of modern Britain? Liberalism is not an ideology with a single founding text or document serving as the basis for all belief. Rather, it is one that, especially in a social regard, seems to be obsessed with the idea of progress at all costs. We know who has outlined and defined this definition of progress, and we know that those who spent years participating in and not questioning the current system of governments in Britain for years did not tend to vote with the idea of society and its future in mind. People almost exclusively tend to vote based on their current circumstances, and a demographically unrecognizable nation was not something that the people who elected the likes of Tony Blair had to worry about. We feel the consequences of their actions whenever we visit any of our city centres today. Diversity under liberalism was, and still is, sold to us as a good thing, our greatest strength. Something that needed to happen in order for us to be taken kicking and screaming into the future, that fuels innovation, that keeps society running, etc. If you've ever watched the news or been to school in this country over the past 20 years or so, you could probably recite it all off by heart. Diversity, in short, to liberalism, is what keeps us alive as a country. Despite the obvious tension, division, ghettoization, de facto segregation and harm it has brought, it is still sold as our greatest strength. It certainly is to those interested in the erosion and polarization of the nation and society as they've been known for thousands of years. But to the man on the street, is a land which is his own through heritage, that he shares with millions who see him as different in his own land, who do not interact with him and who live in isolation to him, really his own? The problems with diversity and mass migration are plain and obvious to see, and have been explained and outlined so many times. But to many in this country, it will never be all immigrants, and that's all that matters. As long as there are the good ones who work, that being the bare minimum, no matter what else they do that might fraction the nation, that will be enough for them. As long as Indians stand behind the counter and do their job at McDonald's, as long as their immigrant friend is very nice, diversity will be the greatest strength of this nation. All attempts to counteract it will have to be struck down, and it will forever remain worshipped as part of the first pillar of the liberal system of governance of this nation. In similar terms to diversity, much of which is intertwined with the second part of this pillar, leftist social ideology is also seen as a guiding principle of the modern British nation. According to liberalism, all must be done to protect all forms of social freedom, no matter how degrading and degenerate they may be, and all must be done to fight any repressive attempts to quell it. Leftism itself is virtually its own religion. Its followers, no matter how religious they claim to be, always place the works of hypothetical reason they gather ahead of faith. Faith, to them, is something that can be rewritten and altered for the purposes of pushing political agendas. It is simply performative given how much they engage in its practice. Leftist social ideology is something that is present in virtually all aspects of everyday British life. Even if the government does not adhere to it by its most stringent of definitions, i.e. the open borders and the issue of transgenderism as of late, its influence is plain to see. The mere idea that the government must follow certain elements of leftist social ideology demonstrates said influence. Much of the youth, which has grown up having these values lectured to them, has chosen to adopt an ideology representative of the extreme social beliefs that they believe to be ideal, and to see the reluctance to accept them as high treason, exemplifying the worship of ideology involved in keeping modern liberal British society afloat. Slowly, as Britain has adopted more and more policies in line with this radical interpretation of liberalism, the enthusiasm of many people has not necessarily grown, but their support has remained strong, and their popularity has grown over time as more people simply become accustomed to the ideas of the time they have grown up with, and the attitudes of the older generations soften with age. As long as leftist, highly liberal, social ideas remain prominent in the media, in academia, and in the vague rhetoric of the state, albeit not being espoused in the fullest form by it, liberal ideas, including that of diversity, will continue to show themselves to be outstanding values of modern Britain. Pillar 2, World War II. If you live in, attended school in, or have even just visited Britain, you will be aware of the impact that World War II has had on us as a nation and our beliefs regarding ourselves. It is drilled into you from a young age. You learn about World War I and the sacrifices that were made, told essentially that it was a just cause because they died for their nation, without any further context being given. But it is with the Second World War that the agenda really begins to take shape. Modern, liberal Britain sees its founding moment as the 8th of May 1945, when victory was declared over Germany and the war in Europe came to its conclusion. When we hear the liberal war cry of, "They fought for our freedom," it is implied as meaning that they fought for the society we live under today, when in reality, as is plain to see in countless interviews with veterans who actually fought in the Second World War, modern Britain to them was not at all worth fighting for. The attitude towards World War II in this country constitutes its place as essentially one of the elements of the liberal religion of modern Britain. The idea that we fought in a global war to defend our territory and way of life is something that would not at all be drawn into question by someone who had not done any research on World War II other than what they had learnt in school or had heard from the older generations, themselves raised on wartime propaganda. We have been raised on the idea that World War II is the most pivotal moment in our entire history, the saving grace and splendor of our people and nation. I am not going to deny that within our recent history it is, but in the entire history of the Anglo-Saxon people, is it really so? Is the moment in which we fought an enemy, seen now by many as the last stand of European society and, as a result, lost everything we had, really the most proud and righteous moment in our history? Who was it really righteous for if we were to lose everything from our empire to our cities and all sense of national pride over the next 80 years? Had history gone the other way and if liberalism did not evolve in the way that it has done, I doubt I would be saying the things I am now about the Second World War. My point is more one of, did the ends really justify the means? Given the point we are at now, where we stand on the verge of a continent almost completely unrecognizable due to mass migration and a gradual decline in our culture and society, to the point where Britain exists outside of our major towns and cities only, and our cities themselves do not resemble anything that could possibly be deemed cultural, was World War II really all that we are told it was? World War II is sold in Britain as the war that saved our civilization that defeated the most powerful enemy in the world, something that can never be allowed to come to prominence again as a result of said defeat, and, as a result of this, justifies the destruction of all that slightly dares question the liberal faith. This same attitude still exists amongst a significant chunk of the population, many of whom will list the fact that we fought the Germans and nothing much else other than maybe diversity when asked about what makes them proud to be British. If this attitude even exists, then the answer is that World War II was fought for anything but Britain. Hence, for the role it has played in defining our national agenda for the past 80 years, World War II earns its place as the second pillar of modern Britain. Pillar 3. The NHS and the social welfare system. We are all familiar with the fact that much of modern Britain obsesses over the NHS. In this current liberal order, it seems the fact that we have a taxpayer-funded social service is regrettably a source of pride amongst most of the population, but nowhere is this more obvious than in the national religion that is the National Health Service. The NHS is viewed as the saviour of the nation, the one thing keeping the country together, and daring to criticise it is almost social suicide. Much of this is linked to pro-migration rhetoric, with anti-migration stances often being met by the blind with replies of, "But if there were no immigrants, what would happen to the NHS?" or the like. The way these people think, you would think that taxpayer-funded universal healthcare was specific to the UK and not something found in the majority of developed nations. It is undeniable that having the NHS is probably better than not having it, as we avoid the extortionate healthcare expenses those in the US face, for example. But this aside, is any of it really worth it when the service itself is substandard and has been for a long time? The ironic thing is that much of the pro-migration crowd will admit that this is the case. The NHS is massively overstrained, not adequately run, but the thing they seem to ignore is that large-scale migration has not fixed this problem. In fact, it has only made it worse. In 1948, at the time the NHS was established, the population of the UK was roughly 50 million. At the time the NHS is generally considered to have been at its absolute peak under New Labour, between 1997 and 2007, the population of the UK was between about 57 to 61 million. It should also be noted that the NHS received an unparalleled amount of funding during this period, and population growth, whilst for the most part fueled by migration, was not placing gargantuan levels of strain on the service. It is very much true that much of the reason the NHS is struggling is due to the level of neglect and lack of funding it received during 14 years of Tory government, but it is never taken into account that if it were not for the huge level of artificial population growth, a significant amount of which is not even documented, the NHS would probably not be in the state that it is now. While I am very much aware of the fact that migration levels are not the only factor behind the strife of the NHS, it is never taken into account that migration itself is a very much prominent reason that the NHS is in the awful state that it currently is. No amount of previous funding the NHS has ever received would be able to smoothly operate the service for a population of 70 million, and where exactly would the extra funding needed for that come from in this system of taxation? The question of where the extra numbers of staff would come from is also one left unanswered, but a frequent justification for mass migration is that it benefits our social welfare services. How exactly more mass migration is going to solve a problem that is largely the result of mass migration is unclear to pretty much anyone. In short, the NHS, whilst undeniably a useful and beneficial service that the majority of people have no problem paying into through taxation, is almost something of a religion in modern Britain. Its existence is vital to the survival of the nation. Questioning its methods of operation and discussing any of the causes of its dire state other than a lack of funding is verboten and antagonizing to a lot of people, and it serves as a source of genuine national pride despite the state that it is currently in. Most people do not want to imagine for a second a Britain in which the NHS in its current form does not exist. This is partly because it would shatter the worldview of a significant number of people, and partly because it would remove a prominent tenet of modern patriotism from existence. To many in this country, the NHS is a genuine source of pride, and, more often than not, one that the survival of can only be sustained through mass migration and continuous liberal virtue signalling. Modern Britain reveres its social safety net as sacred, and thus everything must be done, no matter how contrarian or harmful it is to the nation, to ensure its continued existence. Pillar 4. Our mainstream culture. Mainstream consumer culture and its abundance are certainly not things that are specific to Britain, but their presence in everyday life is undeniably profound. Millions fill the seats at football stadiums up and down the country at 3 p.m. every Saturday. Millions turn on reality TV shows to unwind after a long day at work. Millions throw themselves behind our national sports teams and accept the agendas pushed through their successes. Those are just a few examples of what could be called mainstream modern British consumer culture, otherwise characterized as Britslot. There is nothing inherently wrong with enjoying things, and there definitely is a truth to the Reddit intellectuals' war cry of let people enjoy things, but it gets to a point. When football scores serve as a distraction from the events that unfold around you and that actually affect you, or when you become so consumed by content that does nothing but pacify and nullify the mind, you become a part of a hive mind. Most Western societies struggle with this, the UK being no exception, but it serves as an interesting example regardless. Football, for example, is something that has been weaponized against the British people. The working man's game, commercialized and destroyed by corporate interests, still enjoys a large, loyal following in virtually every corner of this land. Fans fork out large portions of their income on tickets and travel to follow their clubs home and away. Broadcasters generate billions in income, which finds its way into the pockets of clubs themselves, who invest back into the clubs that keep the fans returning for more. The idea of football as being a sport for the working man is completely gone. The idea of it being a genuine tradition is also gone. Season tickets price out local fans whilst tourists snap up the empty seats. But regardless, in an attempt to extract the last enjoyment from the game that they can, fans resort either to forking out on Sky, BT and Amazon Prime to keep up, or risk running into the law with purchases of dodgy television sticks. Regardless of the burdens thrown up against them, the fans keep returning, and the clubs and broadcasters are well aware of this. Football is utilised against the masses to placate them with entertainment on the weekends whilst their nation collapses around them. To many in this country, it is their only peace, their only form of refuge from a life that does not seem worth living, and a nation that in its current form is not worth fighting for. The same loyalty given to football teams is never given to the nation outside of, ironically, the sphere of sports, because in its current form, there is virtually nothing worth being proud of in this nation. In its place, however, stands the glories of the national team and the nation's domestic teams, which suffice for the false patriots, and which are all that exists in way of pride for the castrated. If we have reached a point where teams unrepresentative of this nation are all we have to be proud of, then who are we? Who did anything for us sports-wise before? The media in general serves as another example of how vapid and mindless our mainstream culture is. Large portions of this nation were flocking to their TV sets to watch Love Island long before it exploded in popularity stateside. The happenings of the celebrity world are the be-all and end-all for many, and tabloid newspapers fly off the shelves nationwide daily. I understand that this issue is not specific to the UK, but it is certainly an interesting example regardless. Surrounded by a nation in decline, the result of a political situation that seems to be out of their control, the easy solution is to confide in the happenings of another world, that of reality television and celebrity gossip. As long as that is there, as long as it serves its purpose of distraction and to immerse viewers in fiction, it will always function as intended. Our mainstream news media is no better. For virtually its entire existence, the BBC has served as nothing but the mouthpiece of the state and its tedious rhetoric. Our major newspapers and television channels are controlled by an extremely small and astonishingly wealthy group of people, and the rhetoric pushed by them serves to divide, not to inform or to educate. Yet in spite of all of this, these are hailed as the pros of living in a democracy. If all they do is divide, is there anything virtuous about them? The mainstream news media has served only to mislead and to divide during a period of time where unity is more important than ever before. In addition to this, however, reality TV, celebrity gossip, and football are not alone in the fact that they are tethered to a vapid artificial culture that could not be further disconnected from the culture of this land. No matter how immersed in our traditional values and mannerisms we are, which at the moment are virtually non-existent to many, they do not matter. They do not constitute anything worth protecting or anything of note. With their attention diverted into soulless matters of celebrity worship and consumer sports, anything could be planted upon their nations before their very eyes without them noticing a thing. Thus, in masking themselves as elements of our culture and core principles of our nation, modern football, reality TV and celebrity gossip and the mainstream media serve to inform the British people of what their culture and identity supposedly is, something that can obviously be molded to fit the desires of a few people. Pillar 5. so-called British values. A term with about as much credibility and honour as that of the coalition government which had it blue tacked upon every classroom wall in the country, British values serve to do nothing but inform the youth of what being British truly is, which according to them would be aligning yourself with all of the vague Fukuyama-esque ideas of liberal democracy in a world functioning under principles of the end of history. Legally required to be taught in schools across the country, the 5 values put forward by the coalition are that of democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, tolerance, and respect. There is nothing uniquely British in character about any of these values. They are liberal values, which, as matter of fact, would not sound out of place when lectured to the youth in any modern Western country that has seen its soul and identity eaten away by liberalism. But it is undeniable that when sold as quote-unquote British values, they have an effect on the way people think and what they come to see the identity of their country as being. Although it's pretty unlikely that anyone on the left will give you the direct answer of our shared British values when you ask them what pride they take in being British, the influence of them is still felt in many places, and in many ways they are simply a byproduct of millennial ideas of what Britain is, and through their promotion in the education system, ideas that persist amongst quite a large proportion of the youth. To the idealistic millennial, these values would be those that united their idea of a peaceful, multicultural Britain, one at ease with its cultural and societal decline, actually going as far as to accept that as a good thing more often than not. This mindset is still very much in full force in a lot of settings, especially in public life and amongst the left, with a lot of state mantras still revolving around this idea. But for anyone aware of the downsides of mass migration, multiculturalism, and liberalism, it is obvious that this has not occurred and that it never will. While it is undeniable that fringe elements of the right are certainly more influential and enjoy far more support than they used to say that their ideas are now completely acceptable in the mainstream is quite far-fetched, and the prominence of what I think is better to refer to as the coalition mindset after the government that actually put pen to paper on these ideas is still very much widespread. This coalition mindset refers to that of these vague British values as being genuine uniting principles of the British nation. Even if it is becoming more obvious than ever that this is not the case, as ethnic communities become more and more insular and align themselves with their own, there is still a vague hope within the liberal masses of this nation that we actually are one nation under liberalism. Although their view of us might not literally revolve around the idea of us being united by the coalition mindset itself, their own worldview certainly reeks of it. Their ideas are as out of date as can be, akin to the end of history and some almost messianic notion of a world without conflict that could have only come to fruition in a nation that was 95% white. As long as these values are taught, no matter what form they may be in, and no matter where that teaching takes place, they will always stick with someone and persist as the basis for their ideology. As long as it is passed down, it will continue to broaden the rift that exists within this nation. The coalition mindset, as a vague cornerstone of mindless, utopian liberal ideology, cements itself as the fifth and final pillar of modern Britain, as its persistence exemplifies what the state wants from us and what a large section of the population wants the nation to be. The main thing that can be drawn from this is that Britain is now predominantly a nation of liberal ideas. Its state ideals are liberal, its past victories are liberal, its culture is liberal, and its religion is liberal. It is not a nation that represents anything that it once did, and the cultural change we have seen in recent years has outdone so much of what was once us as a nation. Modern Britain is far from a Christ-worshipping nation. Its religion is liberalism, and its celebration of the faith is consumer society. It is unlikely that any amount of reform will ever do anything to change this, as we find ourselves battling with the ideological remnants of old, which have proven themselves not fit for the contemporary age, and with stark opposition from those whose subscription to them constitutes their entire reasoning for existence. Modern Britain may have found its comfort in liberalism, but the Britain of old never did, and the Britain of the future certainly does not have to. Our true meaning and purpose is found in what our own of old did, and its future will be shaped by those of the present. The final words are, we are the present. We have the ability to shape the future, and we should not pass at this opportunity. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please feel free to like and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated. God bless, and see you soon. No situation is ever unwinnable.